Hello and welcome to another episode here on Captain's Dry Dock. And in the dry dock today, I'm making the phaser rifle from the movie Star Trek First Contact. Wolf?
I have ordered all weapons to be set on a rotating modulation.
Let's make it real. After seeing my YouTube videos making accurate Star Trek comm badges, I was approached by a follower that challenged me to make this prop. At the time of filming this, there are no companies making licensed versions. Well, strictly speaking, there's actually a few. However, one is a 1/6 scale accessory for the epic X06 Picard figure, and the other is this weird Hasbro Borg hybrid Nerf gun thing. Although the US-based replica prop makers, Factory Entertainment, recently announced on Tested that they're currently working on one, and even have a prototype made, but there's no confirmation if and when this will go into production. Now, there are many unlicensed 3D print files made by fans available online. However, these are far from accurate, but don't get me wrong, they're still good for cosplayers and those that aren't like me. But once upon a time, there was a company called Roddenberry's that sold incredible licensed resin replicas that were produced by the same guy that made the production originals, Michael Moore, who I interviewed on this channel, so check that out. But sadly, they're no longer in business, but you can still find their useful PDF instructions online for reference, and there's a few recast ones knocking around on specialist forums. But be warned, they're often in a poor state and expensive. Before design and the making, the first and most important thing is good research. And oh boy, there's so much good reference material out there, which makes it an ideal prop to make a replica. My first steps are always to hit the auction websites, as it's likely they would have sold one, as between 15 to 20 of these were made for the film First Contact. And auction sites are great, as they have really good photos taken from all angles using decent lighting. And more importantly, they include measurements in their description. Also, specialist forums are a place where the real experts lurk, and where the owners of the actual props like to show them off. So, announcing my intentions via specialist Facebook groups, I contacted a few of those owners, and they came back to me with some detailed measurements of certain areas that weren't clear in the descriptions on the auction site. However, this is easily exhausted, as having a guy like me constantly popping up on their messenger, pestering them about how many millimeters is that on there and what angle is that, means, understandably, they get fed up and I get ghosted.
Leave me alone.
Then I heard of a new museum in the UK, not far from London where I'm based, called the National Film and Sci-Fi Museum. And it has the most incredible movie prop collections I've ever seen, including a whole section dedicated to Star Trek. From screen-used uniforms, set display panels, and yes, 2 phaser rifles mounted on a wall that are just a few centimeters away from the protected acrylic. And if you're wondering why those photos are pixelated, it's because you're not allowed to take pictures due to the props being privately owned and loaned to the museum. Except for this one, because that's a promo photo from the museum's website. So with a measuring tape and a pad, I took as many notes as I could, and I didn't take any photos whatsoever.
Nice to meet you, Pinocchio.
It's at this stage I decided very early on how I was going to make and build my replica. Would I use exact materials and methods that the original prop makers used, or would I have the purists clutch onto their pearl strings and use modern materials and methods?
What the hell? Ah!
Well, if you see my channel, you know it's going to be the latter, where I like to make and design in CAD software like Fusion 360 and then 3D print it. Yes, I know some might argue because of that it can't be classed as a replica, but I would say that there were between 15 to 20 of these made for the First Contact movie, all of which are slightly different, such as low detailed stunt versions, ones with detail, and then hero versions with all the detail and light effects. So unless I pick a specific one, then it's impossible to make an exact replica. But what I'm doing is amalgamating all the versions that I researched into one, and make it using modern methods and materials as if the movie was filmed today for HD and they asked me to make them.
You wish.
The important thing for me is that I had to get it visually on-screen accurate, and not just be something to be left on display, but also to be held and not played with, to be shown off.
Sure,
And monkeys might fly out of my butt.
So the textures, weight, and other details will make it feel as if it came from Star Trek's 23rd century and deliver a great user experience to whoever picks it up. Basically, I want to put a childlike smile on the face to whoever holds it.
Oh, baby! This is it! This is what we signed up for!
Now that all the research is done, it was time to finally build. For reference, I needed a photo that was a square on view, no shadows, and was of the highest resolution. However, I couldn't find a photo like that for the round barrel version, but I did have one of the Nemesis version that was ideal. So I decided to use this, as it shares most of the parts, and then I would use the lesser quality pictures from the First Contact version to fill in the gaps. Once the photo was calibrated to the correct length in Fusion 360, I just had to trace it while keeping in mind how I'll put it all together later on physically. To make this solid, I just had to extrude the sections as separate components. Come here, side note, if you're thinking of learning 3D digital CAD modeling, this, although a large prop, is actually a simple design, which I think makes it such an elegant one. Made up of simple shapes of squares, corners, bevels, and chamfers, anyone could make a decent attempt for themselves, so download some free CAD software like Fusion 360 or Blender and just have a go. Although, if you are attempting to make an accurate one, word of warning, I found this part the most difficult to model. And in fact, I had to ask help from a Fusion 360 users Facebook group to point me in the right direction, as the side shoulder stock panels are made up of 7 faces that are raised to meet up at a single point where a few of them even curve into each other. Thankfully, someone showed me a few methods of doing this and it worked out perfectly. As I'm restricted to the size of my 3D printers over there and wanted to include electronics for light and sound effects, as well as a retractable shoulder strap car seatbelt mechanism, I made this build a lot harder for myself. Ah, yes, you did hear me right. I said it's going to incorporate a car seat belt. It turns out that some of the props made for the production included a shoulder strap that retracts into the shoulder stock using a seat belt mechanism. So I reached out to the original prop maker, Michael Moore, who confirmed to me that they did in fact install a heavily modified car seat belt into the stock. So I bought this. Also, I wanted to include that removable computer unit. Now, it was only ever seen and used in the square barrel version of the rifle and in the scene where Picard is adapting the rifle to shoot the Borg and utters the famous line,
"The line must be drawn here. This far, no farther."
However, as the square barrel version uses the same body as the round nose version that I'm making, I thought it would be a lovely detail to include. As I mentioned, it was important that my replica delivered a good user experience and had electronics included. But I didn't want the overall beautiful design disrupted by ugly 20th and 21st century button and switches. An example of this is the trigger, as it has an elegant design that flows with the lines. However, many of the replicas that I've seen that also include electronic pew-pew functions add an ugly button over that trigger and stands out and takes you out of that world. To solve this, I designed the trigger to be a separate piece and add a component behind it to house a tiny micro button that activates the pew-pews, thereby keeping the original look and also being a functional trigger. And there we have it, all the components to make up the rifle and ready to print. During the build, I made regular post updates on Captain's Dry Dock social media accounts, such as Instagram and on Star Trek Prop Facebook groups. And then one day, I got a WhatsApp message from a fellow enthusiast that was excited to tell me that some guy called Max complimented my CAD design. Max who? I replied.
Good question, good question.
And then I looked him up. It turns out this guy was a big deal. Amongst many other things, he was one of the original prop makers on the First Contact production and replied with this update with this amazing compliment.
Nice.
As you can imagine, I was over the moon. I can say that there's no higher praise that one can get than from one of the original makers of the prop that you're trying to replicate.
We're not worthy! We're not worthy!
And it certainly fueled my quest to make the best quality, privately made version of this prop. Anyway, once I came back down to earth, it was time to print. Now, there is a misguided opinion out there that amongst many that 3D printing isn't a craft, and it's all about just pressing a button and letting the machines do all the work. This is far from the truth, and you'll know that if you own a 3D printer. And the point of filming, 3D printing isn't like 2D printing, where it's all about just pressing print and you'll just get whatever's on your screen on the piece of paper. 3D printing requires you to be like a proper manufacturing designer, making sure to design not just to replicate, but also designing taking into account the machine or process making it, whether it be a CNC machine or a 3D printer. This handle is a good example as it's way too big for my 3D printer, so I made it in a few separate parts, also including location holes, so when I stick it all together, it will perfectly align and looks like a single piece. Also, 3D prints sometimes need support, so if they don't warp, collapse or fail while printing. This adds so much time to printing and uses a lot of material, which is costly, when in fact you just need to orientate it in a different way or manually add support where the software sometimes gets it wrong. As I'm lucky to have both a filament and resin printers, I had to work out what parts should be printed on what machine. So here's the rub. Let's talk about printers. These are both 3D printers, although this one is a resin printer and that one over there is a filament printer. The difference is that this one prints in resin with very high detail, no layer lines and practically ready to paint once cured. And this one prints using filament, which is light, cheap and more robust. And the printer that I have can print larger parts. The downside to resin printing is that this stuff is expensive. And the downside to filament print is that they leave layer lines and takes ages to remove. So what do? I use both. Filament for the large simple parts such as the main body, and the resin printer for the detailed and also curvy parts with raised panels. Another thing I need to anticipate was the material, as you can get so many different types of resin and filament. Normally I use this stuff, which is a water washable polymer resin, and PLA filament, as I found that these are really easy to print with. However, this resin is brittle and breaks easily if knocked about, which isn't great for a prop that's designed to be picked up a lot. And PLA has a low melting point and is well known to warp if you so happen to leave your print in a hot car, which isn't great when you're driving to a cosplay event during the summer. So I'm using this newish ABS-like resin and this PTEG filament. Although this resin needs alcohol to clean the print, it's stronger and it's not brittle, and this PTEG has a much higher melting point and means that the rifle won't go limp in my hand.
That's what she said. That's what she said.
Although the digital model looks perfect and everything fits on the screen, there's still a lot of trial and error, such as making sure the parts print correctly and also unforeseen practical issues such as strength. Now this is a very long prop made up of separate components and there's no continuous part running through it, which I realised it could snap in half if mishandled. So back to the CAD design, addressing the issue by adding a channel going all the way through the phaser. This is to accommodate a length of right-angled aluminium that acts like a spine that will be the core and strength of the prop. A detail that I mentioned previously was that I wanted to include the internal computer core. Although you don't get a clear view of it in the movie, there are some clear photos of the secondary prop online. And because there's a lot of detail, I printed it on my resin printer. And as there's no reference to what's underneath it, it gave me a rare opportunity to assert my design inputs. And so I drew this graphic in Adobe Illustrator using the Star Trek style, and even going so far to download a Trek font where I got it from this website and emboss the text with the design. As much as there's a lot of 3D printing involved, there's a few other cool workshop tools that I needed to use, such as my laser cutter. This was to be used in making two isolinear chips that slot into the core. Now, the originals looked boring and didn't have any design detail, which I assume was because it didn't need to, as it was never going to be shown close up. But as any Trekkie will tell you, there's always some sort of detailed matrix design on an isolinear chip. Also, I wanted to keep with my world building and include this detail. Looking at some reference from the TNG technical manual, I designed this in Adobe Illustrator, then imported it in laser cutting software and sent it to my laser cutter that contains a sheet of green luminous acrylic, where the design is etched and then cut out. This was the first time that I used my second-hand laser cutter and they turned out great. To make sure that they didn't slip out of the core and rattle around inside the prop, I designed the slot to have a 0.12mm tolerance, which gave enough resistance to keep them in place, but also the ability to remove them. I also used the laser cutter to make the target graphic that would later be stained with red paint. The next process I had to use was a traditional one of mold making and casting, as there's a distinct glowing light on the top of the targeter. Yeah, I could have 3D printed this in clear resin while adding dye, but I found in my experience it doesn't deliver a pure, translucent, undistorted result. For this, I made a silicone mold from the original non-clear 3D printed part and cast it in epoxy resin, where I used a degassing chamber to suck out any air bubbles. Now this was really important as the part was translucent and any trapped air bubbles would just stand out, especially when lit. Casting is so much of a fast process and allowed me to make multiple versions quickly as I experimented with different colours. As there seems to have been different colours of this part. Now I'm not sure of its fictional function. Was it indicating power mode, or was it there to just look pretty? But there seemed to be a variation of colours depending on the specific phaser prop. It could be that there was a difference between the film and TV versions and subsequent ones made afterwards, or if time had changed the pigment. After all, some of these were made over 20 years ago.
That's so old.
However, after posting this question on a forum, I did get a response from Max, who made the original patterns for the production, and he says that they were an in-between yellow and orange colour, which matches up to many of the on-screen appearances that we've seen. After days of printing and reprinting, making corrections and getting the tolerances right, it took 3 attempts to end up with all the parts to make the final phaser rifle. Now, if you want the first partially made prototypes, feel free to jump into my skip. Now for me came the really difficult part, making electronics for the light and sound effects. Now, from what I'm aware, there were no sound effects built into the original props, as this was added in post-production. And the electronics were relatively simple. Full disclosure, yes, I can solder and make simple circuits, but tackling this was going to need expertise. As my dream was to have this as an all-singing, all-dancing prop that did everything we saw in the film. Well, other than shooting out deadly laser beams because I'm in the UK, that would be confiscated. This demanded the 3 Ps: patience, persistence, and painkillers.
It's giving me a headache.
Here, take 2 of these.
Ah, new print. Little, yellow, different.
Because for this, I needed to use an Arduino Nano, which is a cheap microcontroller. This will allow me to hook up a speaker, buttons, LEDs, and a microcard full of sound effects from the movie. However, I don't know how to code, as it's something that I will learn someday, or an Arduino language, make a sketch. And just like any production, I outsource by going to one of those people hiring websites, advertising my brief, and then picking the best coder within my budget, which turned out to be this guy based in Pakistan. After a week, he wrote me the entire sketch, as well as making a visual schematic of how to wire up all the components. This took some back and forth tweaking to get it working perfectly, but when it did, it was glorious. After sticking to the 3 Ps, I ended up with this temporary working setup, and once happy, soldered it all together as ready to install parts. Also, to help me, I made tiny labels that attached to each wire, so I knew exactly where they needed to be connected without having to trace the wires to their sources. Deep breath. What you're seeing here is the Arduino Nano plugged into its holder. This is a really cool component I recently discovered, as it easily allows me to attach and detach the wires with screw connections. A 40 ohm speaker, MP3 player with micro SD card inserted, including installed MP3 sound effects, a 9-volt lithium battery, 3 red LEDs that go on the side of the rifle, a large orange muzzle flash LED, a standby switch, a power up button, the targeter switch, the the 2 buttons that power up and power down, a white LED light strip for the torch and targeter unit, and a partridge in a pear tree. Just before installing it, I had to perform the final test. Once happy, it was time to untangle and install. First, I started with the targeter, which looked awesome. Now, I was going to use an actual torch light, but I had issues integrating it into my circuit. So instead, I used the light from the LED strips instead. And then I worked my way down the rifle as I stuck it all together with a combination of super glue with the accelerant and 2-part epoxy resin that was used for the really important structural parts. However, I stumbled across an issue. Even though I designed the shoulder stock compartment for the nano and seatbelt mechanism, I didn't take account of the huge amount of wiring that would be inserted in there, which meant the mechanism couldn't fit. In retrospect, I should have made room for the nano in the main body, but it was too late. It was either one or the other. And so I kept the electronics because it was cool, and I would just have to remember to make more room if I ever make another one in the future to include the seatbelt mechanism. The next challenge was hiding the rest of the buttons and switches, except for the on and off button. The original prop had it here, and as it didn't stand out and I wanted to pay homage to the original prop and prop makers, I found a similar button and installed it in the exact same location. Now, the other 2 buttons for the battery power and targeter lights I would need to sort out later on to locate where I can put them, which are accessible but discreet. Now that the entire thing's been put together, I need to address a few compromises that had to be made, starting with the power bar. Okay, this sounds super anal and not in a good way.
Ew!
But the power bar component used in the production version that I have seen had white housing. However, I could only find a black version. Now, I did attempt to repaint this, but it looked messy and sloppy. And as the priority is to make sure the entire thing was of good quality, black it was. And in fact, I feel it looks a lot better. The other compromise was the computer core. Now, the original looked like it had internal LEDs, and one of them was actually blinking, but this meant it would need to have its own battery supply when the unit is disconnected and displayed. So instead, I opted to keep it simple and just have mock painted LEDs instead. Speaking of which, to have the computer core to be able to be taken out and displayed like a secondary prop, just like in this scene, the wire connection of those 3 external LEDs used a micro plug that was set inside the design and hidden behind a panel that covered the socket when detached. Before painting, lots of time was taken to prepare the surface, filling gaps with fine modernist clay like milliput and using 3M putty for the larger parts, as well as leveling off uneven areas. And because some parts were filament printed, tons of filament primer was used to drown them, sand and then repeat. We're at the final stage, painting. Painting replica props is a subject matter in itself, as it's really difficult to get an accurate idea of what paint it should be, as referring to a photo isn't accurate due to not knowing what light in the picture was taken under. And on top of that, paint can age, depending if the prop was stored under direct UV light, which can discolor, especially as they're now a few decades old. The good news is that I had a few accurate sources. Direct communication with the original prop makers. Also, if you remember me mentioning Roddenberry's PDF instructions. These include detailed information on the spray can codes that the film version used. But as every replica prop maker outside the US knows, that US-made props naturally use readily accessible paint brands, but for us outside the US, I'm based in the UK, it's almost impossible to get those specific paints. So it means either going down to the local auto centre, spending time and money investigating the nearest equivalent, which I tried, or getting a can of custom-made spray paint mix. That's if I had a piece of the original prop on me, which I don't, hence the fact I'm making this prop. Thankfully, a UK-based Star Trek prop makers forum recommended the best UK equivalent, which was High Coat Vauxhall Smoke Grey Metallic. However, this sprayed too fast and too thick and only came in tiny cans. Also, personally, I felt it was a little bit too dark compared to the original props I saw in the Sci-Fi Museum. So I ordered the same colour but from a company that mixes and sells it in larger cans, and strangely, it was a perfect match, as well as spraying out a lovely misty coat. As this is a prop that I wanted to be handled a lot, the entire thing was given 3 coats of clear lacquer, except for a few surfaces. Any surface designed to be handled or touched, such as the cheek rest or the handle grips, I use this stuff. This is a car interior spray on rubber paint that gives a tactile texture to any surface, and although it looks like ordinary black paint, it feels so good to touch.
Oh, yeah.
Now, getting back to those 2 switches that I needed to locate, I decided that the targeter switch should be hidden here in the gap, as this can be turned on separately with ease and doesn't stand out. And as for the battery power switch, I decided to hide this by making the cheek panel detachable with strong rare earth magnets. I designed and 3D printed a low profile cap with embossed lettering that sticks directly onto the micro switch underneath. Now, it was at this stage that I changed my mind regarding how I was going to make the battery accessible. Originally, this was going to be via the side panel, but that would have been a ball ache having to unscrew 4 fixings every time you wanted to disconnect or change the battery. So I did a late retrofit and added a compartment accessible via the easy access cheek pad. Speaking of retrofitting, something bugged me throughout the entire project, even at the CAD stage, and that was my big black tip.
Cheeky.
Or to be precise, the seam between the muzzle and the barrel, which made it look circumcised. Now, this seam was on the Nemesis version, and I assume was a separate part that made it easier to install and access the side red lights that the first contact one didn't have. Now, I could have left it, but I felt it interrupted with the beautiful swooping design, and it left me tossing and turning in bed, unable to sleep.
I need to correct it.
As the prop was complete, I had to be brave, so I took a deep breath and did a bit of old school traditional model making and sculpted with fine modeler's clay around the seam and worked it until it made a nice smooth transition into the barrel. Now, this is perhaps one of the largest props I've made here on Captain's Dry Dock, and I feel I've achieved my original brief of being one of the most accurate and well-finished replica first contact phaser rifles. And of course, if you disagree, it's the internet and we're on YouTube. So feel free to leave a comment down below so I can incorporate your changes even when I make another one of these babies. I really hope you enjoyed this deep dive episode, and if you haven't already done so, like, subscribe and follow, including the daily updates from Captain's Dry Dock Instagram and TikTok accounts. In the meantime, my name's John Child. This now needs to be registered with the British Police, and I'll see you on the next episode here on Captain's Dry Dock. Oh, hold on a minute. Sorry, you're turning into the Borg.